well, I think it's time to start. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining this webinar tonight. My name's Liz Mansfield. I'm the chair of Green Party Women, and it's my great pleasure to be hosting this webinar tonight. Just a little bit of housework before we start. Some of you may be much more proficient with using your machines than I am, but I have discovered tonight that if you take your little cursor up to the top of the screen to the right-hand side, you'll see a little symbol next to the word view. And if you click on that, then you will get options. And if you click on speaker view, then you will see largely on your screen the person who's speaking. And if you click gallery view, you'll see all of us very democratically the same size on your screen. So your choice as to how you want to view the meeting. So the other thing to just tell everybody is that the meeting's being recorded tonight. Only people who are speaking and who can be seen will be heard or seen. But this is because there are some people who aren't able to be with us, and it would be lovely for them to be able to hear what Bea has to say after the event. So that's the reason for that. In terms of our timetable tonight, I'm going to give a brief introduction to Bea, and then Bea is going to speak to us for about 40 minutes, after which we'll have half an hour for a question and answer, which will bring us up to round about 9:15. Now, this meeting closes at 9:30, but for those of you who have just come for the webinar, we'll finish at the end of the Q&A. And those of you who are Green Party Women Book Club people who want to stay on and talk about what the next book is going to be, then do feel free to do that. Okay, so without much more ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce Bea Campbell tonight. She may need no introduction, but I'm going to introduce her anyway. Bea's always been a provocative and influential feminist, a writer, journalist, broadcaster, and playwright. She's won many awards, the Cheltenham Festival Literary Prize, the Fawcett Prize, and several honorary doctorates for her work on community, crime, and most recently, children's welfare. Historically, Bea worked for the Morning Star, formerly the Daily Worker, and was active among anti-Stalinists opposed to the authoritarianism of party structures, loudly criticizing the sexism of socialist and communist parties. Active in the women's liberation movement, Bea was a founder of the Marxist feminist journal Red Rag and a member of the Free Communications Group that published Open Secret and campaigned against monopoly ownership of the mass media. She was a columnist on Marxism Today during its peak years in the 1980s, a reporter on Time Out, and was active in setting up the cooperatively owned magazine City Limits. She collaborated with her partner, Judith Jones, writing 2 successful plays, the first of which, And All the Children Cried, addressed issues raised in the book she's here to talk about tonight, Secrets and Silence. Bea was awarded an OBE in 2009 for her services to equality, and is included by the British Library in Sisterhood and After, which is an oral history of the women's liberation movement. About Secrets and Silence, Bea's book has been widely praised, including by Sir Andrew Macfarlane, the most senior family judge in the land and president of the family division. He's flagged up the importance of Bea's book in exposing the, and I quote from him, continuing false belief that the Cleveland children did not experience sexual abuse, and the importance of the book in revealing a lack of transparency which has had lasting impacts. So, without more ado, let's now hear from Bea much more about Secrets and Silence. Thank you very much, Bea. We're looking forward to hearing you.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to so much for this invitation. I suppose the first thing to say is this: why 40 years after the Cleveland inquiry into child sexual abuse, it was the largest public inquiry into child sexual abuse at that time, why is it important to revisit it? Why does it matter? What were its consequences for over those last 4 decades? And why would people like the president of the family division think it was worth commenting on? Well, there are two things I want to suggest make this an important moment to rethink. One's about child sexual abuse itself. The Cleveland inquiry happened in the context of a decade of what I call a decade of enlightenment, an extraordinary era of discovery and rediscovery of child sexual abuse, its prevalence, its consequences, its forms. The second reason I think it's worth revisiting this is the larger political context. Growing concern with the problem of a dreadful political cover-ups that have terrible consequences for those trapped in those cover-ups, but also really important consequences for public intelligence, public consciousness, and the relationship between people who know things and people who need to know things. It goes to this growing campaign that I know many of you are connected with, the campaign to strengthen the duty of candor, the duty imposed on public servants and politicians to tell the truth and to tell as much as possible, so that we all know what we need to know in order to mandate our politicians to do this, that, and the other. And of course, that arises from a profound skepticism about the honesty and candor of our political elites. This is a very important theme in the Cleveland story, and it connects the Cleveland scandal with a number of other scandals that I know you're very alive to. It connects with a duty, what is regarded as a constitutional convention that was introduced by Clement Attlee in the Labour government elected after the Second World War. And there's a paragraph in it that I love. And you're going to have to bear with me because I just love citing it. It's paragraph 27. And what paragraph 27 requires of politicians, ministers in particular, is the duty to not mislead and the duty to share as much information as possible about the actions of government and the reasons for those actions. This constitutional convention has been serially refined, and it's now expanded into the great movement for a statutory duty of candor. And I'll tell you in a bit why Cleveland should be at the core of this movement. But let's start where it starts. Obviously, happened in 1987 when some mad and zealous paediatricians and social workers identified signs of sexual abuse scripted on the bodies of little children that to some people, particularly the police, were inconceivable. They were also acting upon what they felt was a new mandate by the government, which had in 1986 specified upon suspicions of child sexual abuse. Now, the larger context of Cleveland was this, that in 1986, in the context of many discoveries about childhood adversity, which dominated the professional agenda for the caring professions in the 1980s. There were several features that dramatised the importance that was felt to be attached to the problem of child sexual abuse in the 1980s. In 1986, paediatricians in Leeds wrote a paper for The Lancet that had a really radical effect on how paediatricians were able to think about problems that might be afflicting children who had sore bottoms, who were failing to thrive, who were generally ailing, often without any explanation. And what they drew on was the scientific discoveries a century earlier in France, a great crucible of forensic science, where one of the pioneers, Ambroise Tardieu, found evidence of anal rape in children. In the Cleveland case, their average age was, and what he identified was this phenomenon in the context of other abuses that he was identifying in family life. He had considerable authority because he was the person who had identified all sorts of grotesque industrial diseases in France and mass urbanization in France. Okay, so they identify this phenomenon in the caseload of children who they were seeing in their hospital in Leeds. And what they argued was that buggery was more common amongst young children than battery. Now imagine, this was a hugely controversial and challenging thing to assert, because in the 1980s people had become very well aware of the phenomenon of the battered baby. So this was in people's heads, and so to associate this phenomenon with that phenomenon was remarkable. At the same time, this is 1986, the government issues a circular that, amazingly enough, for the first time, something which, if professionals had suspicions, they were obliged to act and to intervene. So this is the first time. The other thing that happened in 1986 was the formation of Childline, a new universally children who were constantly flooded with children making calls about sexual abuse. This had to be understood also in the context of a larger network of services created by the women's movement, rape crisis centres, women's aid, and in particular the rape crisis centres, where the majority of people accessing their services were women who were recalling childhood sexual abuse about which they had told no one until this moment. So there were many services and agencies that were just before the Cleveland. One of the important features of the Cleveland situation was that its neighbours to the north, in Tyneside, had a very well developed relationship between the police, women's services, women police doctors who were specialising in forensic work with survivors of sexual crime. It wasn't always easy, but they had developed very well refined collegial relationships. In Yorkshire, neighbouring Cleveland, likewise, there were very well developed relationships between the police, paediatricians, rape crisis centres, women's movements, and services for children who were living in adversity, and social services. Okay, so this is the environment in which Cleveland in 1987 combusts. One of the things that I think makes that context important for us to bear in mind is that in our collective memory, Cleveland is associated with a handful of mad people who were seeing sexual abuse everywhere and were whipping children from their beds at night and were just being thoroughly unreasonable. What was happening in Cleveland makes more sense when we bear in mind the national context and the experiences of professionals working either side of Cleveland. Okay, so we're at 1986. We're approaching 1987, where paediatricians in Cleveland were empowered, shall we say, by the arrival of a new paediatrician who'd been on courses about child sexual abuse, Dr. Marietta Higgs. She had been waited with great interest because Cleveland's records on child sexual abuse were minimal. The rates were very, very low. There was a sense that something was just hugely hidden, and it was about to be addressed by the new mandate provided by the government and a new commitment to collegial collaboration, known as working together amongst professionals who had a responsibility for addressing sexual crime and in particular childhood adversity. Okay, so that's the context. I have to tell you that that Cleveland doesn't really begin in 1987, which is the general assumption. It kind of begins in 1986 for all the reasons that I've described, but not least because a child is taken into care. In fact, two children are taken into care in 1986 who become Cleveland children and who in some ways personify the dilemmas and contradictions that were found in the Cleveland case. One's a boy who describes extravagant cruelty at home, extreme violence and sexual sadism by his stepfather. He also identifies his little sister, who was also being subjected to sexual abuse, and their cases are taken very, very seriously. They're taken into care. And there's a crucial difference, however, between these two, the boy and the girl. The boy doesn't stop talking. The girl never talks. Her view was that if she talked, there would just be bedlam, and it was best to stay stumm. And she did. She was typical of the majority of children who endure child sexual abuse. The majority never talk about it until they're adults. And this is one of the things that becomes very salient in the Cleveland controversy, because the Cleveland case is about physical signs. Very rare. You don't expect to find physical signs of child sexual abuse. But here they were, physical signs written on the bodies of children, in this case, their bottoms, that in the forensic literature were associated with chronic anal penetration. We'll say a bit more about that in a second, but the importance of these two is that the girl never talks. She's typical, as I say, of the majority of people who endure sexual abuse in their childhood. The boy he didn't stop talking. They were believed. To an extent, not to the extent that the criminal justice system was engaged, prosecuted the named, identified, witnessed perpetrator, for reasons that are really entirely to do with what becomes the crisis of Cleveland. So we hit 1987. The paediatricians are beginning to identify physical signs of child sexual abuse, of anal penetration, chronic, in children who had been of concern, some of them for years and years, failing to thrive, lots and lots of problems. They exercised the minds of social services and health services for most of their lives, many of them. And finally, when there are full examinations of their bodies, and many of them begin to talk about what's happening to their bodies, that the mystery of why they were just not well begins to become clear. They are living with day-to-day rape. And because the physical signs are so dramatic, the professionals who identify these scenes, the paediatricians, are of course duty bound to refer them to social services, which they do. Social services in Cleveland had made child sexual abuse a priority, and so they act upon it. They've gone on courses. They've got health visitors who are supporting them, visiting these children. And there's a kind of sense amongst the social work community that they're beginning to understand something that these children endure. They're beginning to understand something else as well, typified by these two children, which is that some speak and some don't. The ones that don't exemplify a phenomenon that was by then very, very well understood. And indeed, it was understood not only by professionals who were working with child survivors of sexual abuse, but with survivors of atrocities generally. One of the great professionals who worked with survivors of the Holocaust describes it thus, that silence is both sanctuary and defeat. It's safety and it's danger. The great American therapist, feminist therapist, Judith Lewis Herman, writes about the contradictory imperatives in the psyche of survivors, which is to proclaim what was happening, to have it understood, and absolutely deny what was happening, to stay stum. So this is one of the contradictions that lies at the heart of the difficulties that professionals experienced in Cleveland, because even though these very rare physical signs were being identified, that the professional literature insisted was indicative of child sexual abuse. Those children who couldn't or wouldn't speak presented such a challenge to the police, who in the Cleveland case were unschooled in cooperation with other professionals. Indeed, they weren't only unschooled, they were extremely reluctant. This was a macho police service that didn't like having to cooperate with lesser mortals, social workers, health visitors, paediatricians, often women who knew more than they did, which they didn't like at all, of course. So after maybe 2 months, faced with children whose bodies did describe dreadful chronic acts, were confounded by the children's either inability or reluctance to speak. Around about half of what becomes 121 children in the Cleveland case didn't have a story to tell, or didn't tell a story, put it that way. And that prompted the police to a public mutiny. They didn't believe the sign. They hadn't been on courses. They hadn't read the forensic pathology textbooks. And they certainly didn't like having to bow, as it were, to the words and wisdom of other professionals who happened to be women. So what happens in Cleveland then is, within some few months, the police go public with their protest. Innocent families are being subjected to miscarriages of justice. We don't believe this. We don't believe these doctors. We think there's a conspiracy against respectable families. Now, the government reaction to this only became clear to me when I was delving into the records in the National Archives, where a subtle shift becomes discernible in the correspondence therein. At first, the Social Services Inspectorate and the Northern Regional Health Authority advised the Department of Health that the paediatricians are credible, that they are highly valued, highly experienced, and above all, credible and calm. That the Social Services Department were acting according to the letter of their statutory obligations. Furthermore, when the Social Services Inspectorate dispatch a team to Cleveland to check out whether they've all gone mad or not, find that they're acting, as I say, according to the letter of their professional duties, but also they're acting credibly, and they're acting in a context where there is a crisis of resources. There's a crisis of resources everywhere. What was kind of unsaid during this time, I only later discovered it in boxes that had been buried away in a loft somewhere for decades, that the lead paediatrician in the Northern region wrote to the Northern Regional Health Authority in 1986. Remember, 1986 is where all this happens, all this starts. And this paediatrician warns the Northern Regional Health Authority that there is a juggernaut of child sexual abuse referrals assailing paediatricians across the region. This is consistent with a national phenomenon. The Social Services Inspectorate is told that that the rate of referrals within about 6 months nationally had increased 139%. Okay, so this is a national phenomenon with a number of really serious problems. One, that if these allegations, if this evidence is serious and reliable, then there needs to be adequate and appropriate police investigation and an appropriate response in the criminal justice system. And that's really where Cleveland hits a crisis, because the police decide within 2 or 3 months that they will not investigate. And indeed, the chief constable issues an instruction to his officers that they will not respond to referrals of sexual abuse from the Middlesbrough General Hospital where the paediatricians were working. A huge crisis, huge combustion. It hits the papers, everybody's worried. The local MP, Stuart Bell, who became notorious because he was he was an MP who refused to in person with his constituents. A dreadful right-wing Labour politician he was. Anyway, so he goes public and said, I am not going to allow my children to be sent to Middlesbrough General Hospital. And so the government is really under pressure to do something. Instead of responding to what the Social Services Inspectorate was finding, which was that the evidence was credible, that the professionals involved were credible, that they were acting according to their statutory obligations, they decide to call an inquiry, a public inquiry. In the meantime, the Social Services Department had persuaded the Regional Health Authority that they should appoint independent specialist experts, independent assessments. of the paediatrician. They were acting fast, and the Department of Health was told that there would be the conclusions of these independent assessments within weeks. But the Department of Health decides to preempt that and call a public inquiry. Public inquiry is called. And one of the things that emerges from the correspondence in the Department of Health across the lifetime of the inquiry is how the disposition of the senior civil servants and the ministers begins to change. It changes from these people are doing what they're expected to do. They're doing it without extra resources. That's a problem, but there are problems everywhere. Changes from that to who are we going to blame? Who are we going to blame? What went wrong? And it's the Department of Health, remember, that's commissioned this inquiry. The inquiry goes on. This story at the time, and then rereading the report nearly 40 years later, 30, 40 years later, I was taken by surprise constantly by things that I hadn't noticed at the time. At the time, I thought the inquiry was a way of knowing what had happened. These children abused? Were they not abused? Were these professionals mad? What? There's a hidden little paragraph in the report that says, we have no reason to question the medical findings of Dr. Marietta Higgs and her colleague, Jeff Wyatt. Oh, you might think to yourself, if you noticed that, right, well, they were onto something serious then. No more is said. Later chapter of the Cleveland report, the one that kept on being raised year after year after year in the in child protection proceedings. Chapter 12 is preoccupied not by the signs and the reliability, credibility of the physical signs, and why they might be telling a really important story about what is happening, but what a child cannot speak is happening. It shifts its attention to the conditions in which children might speak. Now, bear in mind, at the time, it was well known that children rarely described child sexual abuse in their childhood. If they talked about it at all, it was as adults. It was rare for children to, the word used is, it was rare for them to disclose. But in chapter 12, and I hadn't noticed this at the time, revisiting it, read these words that I have to say I was completely astonished by. That says, on the rare occasions that a child chooses not to tell, professionals have permission to take no action. When I reported this to a child sexual abuse expert working in a government agency, she was completely astonished. Oh my God, she said, because this was so contrary to what everybody knew at the time. Children don't tell. The Cleveland report, the mighty Cleveland report that framed child protection processes thereafter, actually says, on the rare occasions that a child chooses not to tell, permission to not act. Wrong, wrong, wrong.
Bea,
The other important
Bea, can you hear me?
thing.
Hello, Bea. I'm just letting you know that
Yes,
you've got.
I can.
I'm just letting
Yes.
you know you've got 10 more minutes.
Marvelous. Okay, so the cabinet's very upset about it because it's not tough enough about the paediatricians and the social workers. They are not, the report is not condemnatory enough. And so in the days before the report is to be presented to Parliament in 1988, in June 1988. There's a lot of coming and going, and conferring between the Treasury and the Department of Health comes to this position. And I'm going to read this to you because you need to take it from what was said then. Correspondence between John Major, who was in the Treasury, and the Department of Health says that the Treasury has been, that the diagnoses of child sexual abuse were correct in at least 80% of the 121 cases. But this is, quotes, dangerous territory for us to get into. Why? Because this could be turned back on us later as bids for extra expenditure. In other words, the really crucial information that the majority of the children were believed to have been abused, raped, would be suppressed. And it framed the way in which the Cleveland report was covered in the mass media. The overwhelming impression was A, that the diagnosis was bonkers, and B, that predatory. And that disposition has informed the way in which the child protection system at the time of Cleveland, around about protection plans were conceived with references to child sexual abuse. So child sexual abuse was present in the concerns of the professionals who were intervening on behalf of these children. Going on 40 years later, that figure descends from 21% to around about 3 to 4%. And in some boroughs, 0%. The outcome, therefore, of the Cleveland legacy has been to steadily erode the salience of child sexual abuse in the consciousness of professionals, and to steer child protection away from child protection to policing and prosecution and an obsession with the conditions in which children might speak. And we know that actually the likelihood is that they won't speak. So here we are then with a key thing to ask ourselves: how did that happen? How did the Cleveland report have such a deadening effect, such a destructive effect on that great era of enlightenment? Well, one of the things that we can say for sure is that there was a cover-up, and that the crucial information that the public needed in order to grasp the salience of this problem was that the professional consensus was that most of those children were abused, instead of which we've been led to believe that actually they weren't. Thus, the professional community and the public and the political system has been misled to disastrous effect. And I leave you with one question, which is, so what do we do about that? Thank you for listening.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that, Bea. And it's a shocking. I've heard Bea speak about this before, and every time the hard reality of what happened in Cleveland is shocking all over again. And indeed, that is the question. What do we do about it? How do we, what space is there to get into private nuclear families where such abuses take place? So that's a question for Bea, but let's invite anyone who has anything that they would like to say. Please stick your hand up now. In case you don't know, at the bottom of your screen, you've got a series of icons, and one of them is, well, mine is a little kind of heart on its side, looking a bit askance at me, with react written underneath. And if you click on that, you'll see that you've got a facility to raise your hand. So please do raise your hand, anyone who would like to ask a question, or of course you could write a question in the chat. Now my challenge is, can I actually see any hands raised? I can. Kate, super. Do come in. Thank you.
Hi there. Thanks ever so much, Bea. It's really interesting because I remember Cleveland being talked about when I was training to be a doctor, and it was kind of being battered around, and I was too young to, I think, probably really understand exactly what was happening. And like you say, a lot was hidden from us. I've got two questions for you. You may have already answered one in what you said already, but my first question is, what was the most shocking part of this whole story as far as you're concerned? Or you might want to add in some other ones to what you've already said. And the second was, I attended the online Zoom half an hour about Justice for Zane, or Truth for Zane, last night, and we talked, and it was discussed about this need for, I can't remember the official term, but telling the truth. And I wondered what the overlap between Cleveland and this push for telling the truth by public bodies. Was this something that started quite soon after Cleveland? Can you fit that into a history or trajectory at all? Or did it impact it?
Yeah. Shall I have a go at that? The most shocking for me was slowly watching the change of tone in the correspondence, the ministerial and senior civil servant correspondence, away from a recognition that this was a serious phenomenon, that the professionals were credible, they were acting according to the professional regimes at the time, which were relatively cumbersome and unreformed. And that culminates in the decision before the parliamentary debate to suppress the most important fact, the thing that was on everybody's lips, the question: were these children abused or not? Was the medical evidence credible or not? We were led to believe that it wasn't, but it was. And that framed child protection practice and policy thereafter to this day. I suppose the shock was that that drift towards skepticism culminates in an absolutely cynical decision. We will suppress this information because it will lead to demands for extra resources, full stop. So we will save money, but we won't save children. That's the great shock. The second thing, apropos of the second point that you raise, is that there's a parallel process. At the same time as the inquiry was beginning to take form, after all the evidence had been heard, after the majority, 27 out of 29 medical experts, saying if you don't act on these signs, you'd be really vulnerable to criticism. At the end of the actual hearings, it is determined that the paediatricians will be blamed, that they will take the fall, as it were. So that's happening in January 1988. In the same month, ministers involved in defence are taking decisions which are secret about amending the regulations that prohibited the sales of arms to Iraq during the Iraq-Iran war. And that secret deal combusts some years later when the aforementioned said John Major in 1994 commissions an inquiry, becomes the Scott inquiry into illegal arms sales to Iraq. And so this is, these are parallel moments, right? And one of the things that I thought was hauntingly salient to the Cleveland case was when the Scott inquiry concludes the following: that ministers designedly and deliberately misled the public, and that they created the conditions in which there was debate without knowledge. Now, that seems to me to describe precisely the Cleveland phenomenon. In the case of the Scott report, of course, Parliament was told that. It was told the truth about what ministers had colluded in and the ways in which they had colluded to keep it secret, not only to do something illegal, but to keep it secret. So I think those terms describe precisely the core of this very cynical Cleveland enterprise. We are still to have any official acknowledgement of that cover-up. It was acknowledged in the Scott report, and of course, subsequently, the public has got more and more exercised about these cover-ups. Zane is one case, the post office is another, contaminated blood another. There is Hillsborough's another. There is this crowd moving in on public consciousness. And I think one of the important things about that is that it's managed, it has to be managed in a way that honours truth-telling as part of political discipline and political duty, rather than encouraging a feeling that, oh, well, they all lie, don't they? And, well, it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter. And people feel that it matters. Politically, we have to make that feeling matter. Does that help?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Can I just, this isn't my place really, but I would just like to say, because Kate, you mentioned the truth about Zane last night, in terms of what Bea's just described coming together into a legislative form, when Theresa May commissioned the inquiry into Hillsborough, which was led by Bishop James Jones, one of the things that he identified, which had to be made into law, and is indeed part of the Hillsborough Bill, which the Labour government promised to debate before the 37th anniversary of Hillsborough, is to put into law a duty of candour. If we'd had that, none of this could have happened, because you could be criminalised if it was shown that you didn't tell the truth. So that's the kind of legal situation currently. We all need to keep our eye open for the passing of the Hillsborough law. Okay, Anne, you've got your hand up. Please come in.
I think I found reading the book very distressing. One of the most inspiring parts of it is the story of Jerry Day, where the woman there has noticed that she was a woman, because the man was a woman. Instead of embracing shame, managed to create within her community a sense of pride that they dealt with before, or he's tried to deal with the sexual abuse that is going on there. We know that shame is a very destructive emotion. It's why people are abused. I wonder how we can create in this country that sense of pride in dealing with any sort of abuse, but more specifically sexual abuse against children. Well,
Yeah. Well, you've raised a really challenging issue. There was a decision, nobody knows when it was taken, but it was taken, that the Cleveland children would not be followed up as a group. So nobody knows whether they thrived or whether they suffered. Nobody knows what they now think as adults. My book begins with the story told by Minnie, who at the age of 40 decided to become a detective in her own life. She wanted the truth. She wanted to discover the truth, actually, about her own experience, because all of these children were faced with a national narrative about themselves, about which they were not consulted. We didn't learn from them. We don't know anything about them. They aren't the subjects of the inquiry, and so they're not the subjects of that national narrative. And the national narrative traduces what their experience was. And your point about shame is completely relevant. Only one, Minnie, has come forward to tell her story, having, well, before she had access to her personal records and after she had access to her personal records, which I have to say she was profoundly shocked by, because the things that she learned about her own childhood were much, much worse than she remembered. She's the only person, the only Cleveland child come forward before and after accessing her records to tell her story. And her story is that she feels she was saved by the much maligned Marietta Higgs. And your point is right. Shame, I think, for probably, well, who can tell? We don't know. But for the Cleveland children, they were the subject of, well, the objects of a national controversy that dominated our newspapers, our mass media coverage for a year. And what are they now to make of what was going on then, of what they understood about their own lives? 2, 3, 4 before school when all of this was happening. How are they to make sense of their own experience when, I mean, I've seen the inventory of these children that was delivered to the public inquiry bears very little resemblance to anything that we've been subsequently told about these children. What are they supposed to do with that? And what are they supposed to do with an experience of abuse, if that figure is right, at least 80% diagnoses were correct? What are they supposed to do with that knowledge? It's horrifying.
Okay, Bea, there's a couple of questions have come in, or there's a question and then there's a contribution. So this first question from Loppy is, have any of the Cleveland abusers since been brought to justice when the children grew up?
It's worth having a look at a documentary by a great documentary maker, Tim Tate. It's on YouTube. Dozen adults who were very public in their protestations, and he confronts them with evidence of either previous convictions or previous allegations that were taken seriously about them. These were people who had been very public in their denial of the suspicions of child sexual abuse. So actually, we know nothing really about whether people were brought to justice. I do know of several cases where children in later years made allegations about perpetrators, and when they arrived in court, the court's view was, well, it was all a lie then, so it's all a lie now. There hasn't been justice for the children in Cleveland, not at all.
Thank you, Bea. And then there's what I would describe as a contribution in the chat from Susan Harrison to everyone. And it says this: what you highlight very much fits with my experience as a social worker conducting child protection inquiries. We experienced a huge upswing in children being referred for suspected sexual abuse, and also children disclosing abuse between 1989 and 1993. I then moved to another department for 5 or 6 years, and when I returned to frontline practice as a team manager, sexual abuse referrals had dropped to a very low level. We'd gone from children at risk of sexual abuse being the highest category on the Child Protection Register, as it was then known, to the lowest. No one talked about it, and I was very troubled by it and suspected it was an organisational response, likely linked to resources, and also a reluctance to acknowledge the extent of sexual abuse of children by almost always men. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that, Susan. Any other questions? Do put your hands up, please, or put something in the chat. If no one's coming forward at the moment, I've got a question, Bea. You know, you left us with, so where do we go from here? Is anything happening? Are there any signs that you can see that people are wanting to address this matter now? Talk about the unspeakable, and think about ways in which sexual abuse of children can be unearthed and perpetrators can be brought to justice, and the dirty secrets of the nuclear family can be sprung apart.
Well, I confess to being very pessimistic, because I think we've got we live with the contradiction, which is a huge level of public consciousness. Doesn't know somebody who doesn't know somebody who doesn't know somebody who had experienced child sexual abuse. It's there in public consciousness. However, that doesn't translate to professional. We've had now for well, we had, you know, you'll all be familiar with the inquiry into child sexual abuse. That was in institutions. Were in institutions because they'd already endured abuse at home before they were taken into care. That wasn't the issue for the independent inquiry, but it was, I thought it was very illuminating. It attracted almost nil attention. Meanwhile, the government focused and almost exclusively on so-called Asian gangs and sexual exploitation. And one of the last initiatives of Priti Patel as Home Secretary was a new strategy for addressing child sexual abuse, which goes on and on and on about Asian gangs. And has very little to say about child sexual abuse in the main domain in which it happens, the home. What we've learned is Ofsted did a report in, I think it was 2020, lamenting the demise of attention to child sexual abuse within the family, saying that there weren't police strategies, there weren't municipal strategies, that it was, so to say, to put it coarsely, a dead duck. And then we've had the latest National Safeguarding Panel review, which comes to the same conclusion as why 40 years after Clean disappeared from the professional agenda. Where it goes to answer that question is secrets and silence and the cover-up. So here we are in a government, with a government which is really not in any way, in any significant way, determined to undo the appalling consequences of the massive cuts in public service and in municipal services. And I very much doubt that we are going to hear anything from this government about massive reinvestment in the identifying of risk of child abuse and raising public consciousness in schools at large about this phenomenon, how it's sustained, what sponsors child sexual abuse, and what we do about it. I think we're faced with a kind of a very tough knot that's between what we know collectively and whether that can translate into professional and political action. And that's the task that we face, how to translate that into something that will make a difference.
I've got a contribution, which is a question from Sarah Bingham to everyone. Do you think teachers and social workers will get to a point again of recognizing, quote, failure to thrive, maybe a good indicative of a child or children being sexually abused? Just thinking back to a family at school where I taught in 1990, we referred for neglect or failure to thrive a family of 3 children, and investigation led to an ever unfolding horror story of multi-generational family sexual abuse. So thoughts about that, Bea? Do you think teachers and social workers might get to a point again of recognizing that failure?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I can't hear you, Bea. Have you frozen or?
Oh, sorry.
There you are.
Well, can you hear me now?
We're back. Yes, we can. Hello.
Yeah. So, okay, this is Kate's point. The most recent inquiries into sexual abuse. Have they? I think they have. I think that many of them are revelatory. They need to be taken really seriously. The problem that we've got is that the previous government was absolutely not interested at all in investing in the answer to the question that you've asked. This government has proved itself to be a hostile environment for anyone asking for the resourcing of raising consciousness and creating the conditions in which there could be justice for children. So it's bleak, and we have to confront that. I think that the signs are that in the judiciary there's a huge amount of worry.
We're losing. Oops, we're losing you, Bea.
Have your question? Have they? I'm back again. Am I back?
Yes, you're back.
Right. From what we've uncovered, well, it depends on who's doing the learning. The specific inquiries into particular crises are often very good. Whether they translate into commitment, I don't think so. I don't think so. the amount of reporting that goes on in yeah, Loppy, yeah, yes, awful. Child pornography, easily accessed, terrible.
No, you're coming and going a bit for us, unfortunately. But yeah, B, you're frozen just at the moment.
Yes.
Do we have any other questions? I'm just seeing if there's another hand up. Press escape. Hang on, I'm having a bit of trouble myself now. Oops, there we go. Okay, one thing to become aware of is the reduction of age of consent. Jill is pointing out to everyone. One thing to be aware of is the reduction in age of consent.
Can I just say a word about consent?
Yes, please.
There's some fantastic work by Ellie Hansen, who's a psychologist, about consent. What she's interested in is this: in what conditions can a child consent? Could they ever consent? Certainly in terms of the question of child sexual abuse. So I would urge people to seek her out, Ellie Hansen, Elly Hansen, who's written a paper on consent. Have a look at it, because she challenges the context in which making assumptions about when consent can ever be given.
Yeah, I don't know if you, great. I don't know if you can see the chat, but Sarah's saying, do you think that child sexual abuse happens mainly to girls? And this could be why it's regarded as less important?
What the research in the that was interested in the medical evidence was that the ratio of boys and girls was more or less equal. The younger the child is, the prevalence amongst boys is higher, and we may not yet even have accurate information about boys because children pre-puberty, the prevalence amongst boys is very high.
Okay, thanks, B. Another in the chat from Susan, a key aspect of the shortfall in resourcing is found in the sentencing of convicted offenders. Few get custodial sentences. Also, a concern to avoid removing children from the family home and pressure to reduce the numbers who are looked after are low.
Yeah. And that situation is being compounded by the ways in which, in post-separation cases, allegations about child sexual abuse may emerge and often will be repudiated by typically fathers as, oh, they're making it up and the mothers are making it up and they're making it up because they're horrible. So it's a significant part of the current debate about post-separation divorce, high levels of litigation, and the deployment of the idea of parental alienation. often by people who've been accused of abuse.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bea. So we're coming to the end of our time. So do please, anyone else who's got a question for Bea or a contribution to make, now is your moment. I'm really sorry, Bea, that we've lost bits of what you've said because of the signal, which is very unfortunate, but we got most of it, at least I did. Anything else coming up? Okay, well, let's declare this part of the session ended. But just before you go, Bea, I did want to flag up to everyone about your new book. So Bea has got a new book coming out, which is called Planet Patriarchy, Global Tales of Feminism and Oppression. And the book launch for this book is on the 3rd of July. And I'll just read a little bit about it to whet your appetites, because it might be something that the book club wants to come back to. I've had the privilege of reading a couple of extracts myself and think it's riveting, imperative reading. This blurb here says, the book reveals patriarchy's many faces in the age of globalization, exploring the political systems and cultures of 8 very different societies. It takes readers from the extraordinary anti-capitalist women's revolution in Kurdistan to the theocracies of Islamic State and Saudi Arabia, from China's one-party state to Iceland's democracy, and to South Africa, Russia, and El Salvador, all radically changed since the fall of apartheid, communism, and military dictatorship, respectively. Despite patriarchy's remarkable shape-shifting powers to undermine feminist solidarity, Planet Patriarchy is equally a story of sisterhood and resistance, interviewing defenders of women's rights about their cause and their country. Gender inequality endures everywhere, but so does feminism. Rahila Gupta is the co-author of the book with Bea, and it says here that Campbell and Gupta's fascinating discoveries show us how this timeless showdown is taking shape in and being shaped by the systems we live under today. And Bea's book, Bea and Rahila's book, is being published by Hearst Publishers, or you can get a pre-order copy at the hashtag Our Feminist Library. So with that, thank you so much, Bea. Absolutely brilliant.
Thank
as
you
always.
so much. Thank you for being so very interesting.